Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. Unleashed is produced by Umbrex, which connects you with the world's top independent management consultants. And I'm your host, Will Bachman. I am extremely excited to be here today with Roger Samways, who is the Vice President of Cargo Sales at American Airlines. I was a proud executive platinum on American for a number of years while I was at McKinsey. No longer as an independent consultant, but I certainly flew a lot on American, and it's very exciting, Roger, to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Great. Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for your support of American Airlines.
So, Roger, I thought we could do two things on the show today. One, just kind of you giving us a primer on air cargo industry in general for listeners
Yeah.
who don't know much about it, and then in the second half, after we get through that, talk a bit about what's going on with the coronavirus pandemic. So maybe start with a primer for people that haven't really thought about air cargo a lot. Help us understand the structure. Are there dedicated airlines, that are just focused on that? Talk about
Yeah.
passenger airlines. How does air cargo work?
Yeah. Well, it's a hugely important industry and one that we all rely on day to day, but actually many people don't know a huge amount about, Will. So there are really two major groups of carriers transporting cargo. On the one hand, we have airlines that are freighter operators, operating freighters. Included in that number are what we call integrators, so companies like UPS, DHL, and FedEx. And they are transporting cargo in planes which are only carrying freight. So those planes are called freighters. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have the rest of the airline industry, passenger carriers that utilize the belly capacity in their aircraft to carry cargo, and American Airlines fits into that particular group. Actually, belly capacity is hugely important. The majority of business around the world actually moves in the belly of passenger aircraft. That situation, that dynamic has changed over the last few years as more modern aircraft have been introduced into service. So typically the cargo capacity on those aircraft grows. And so we find aircraft like 787-9s and 777-300s incredibly cargo capable aircraft. In fact, we've recently set a record. This is great timing. We're having this call, Will. A couple of weeks ago, we set a record for one of our passenger aircraft, a 777-300, that was transporting seeds from Buenos Aires up to Miami. We actually transported a little over 118,000 pounds. So that's 50 something thousand kilos for those of you thinking metric. From Ezeiza up to Miami. So hugely capable. Um, all sorts of products rely on air freight. If you can imagine, air freight is relatively expensive. It's certainly much more expensive than other modes of transport, such as rail and sea. And so, what you typically find under ordinary circumstances is the bulk of material that flies via air tends to be very time sensitive and often is very expensive. And so we move lots of things like laptops, cell phones, on the one hand, but we also move lots of highly perishable cargo, such as foodstuffs and flowers. Um, Very different depending on the markets that we're serving.
Give us just a rough idea of the price difference. So, I don't know how it's typically structured, if it's sort of by the cubic volume or by the weight or both. But could you compare, if I wanted to ship 100 kilos from Peru or something to the United States by air versus by sea, what's the right way to compare it? I'd love to get some way to compare sort of air versus sea in terms of that.
Yeah, yeah, it's difficult, Will, to give a direct comparison. So, in answer to your question, do we sell in volume or weight? The answer to that is yes. It's both. So there are two different metrics we use: the weight of the cargo, but also the capacity, the volumetric capacity that it takes. So much depends on the routing. So much depends on the particular market conditions. But typically air freight compared to sea freight, I mean, it wouldn't be unusual to find a difference of 10x or more in terms of cost.
Yeah, so it's a really very different market. If you need to fly it by air like flowers, you can't have it be on a cargo ship and take a month to get here.
Exactly,
So
exactly right,
so you're not really
exactly right.
usually making the comparison. Probably it's if you need to fly it by air, you're not going to worry about the price
No,
differential.
no, exactly. And in fact, many of the customers that we deal with, our customers on the cargo side are typically what are called freight forwarders. They're a bit like the old agency companies used to be on the passenger side of the business. And so we move business for all types of major manufacturers. Apple, GSK, you name it, we move their product. But we're typically working and engaging directly with what are called freight forwarders, and the freight forwarder deals with the often the packing of products. They deal with things like customs requirements, picking a product up from a manufacturer and dropping it at the airport, and then the airline deals with all of the logistics involved with transporting that shipment from one airport to another airport, and then the freight forwarder performs their work in reverse. And so, we deal with freight forwarders, and freight forwarders typically will have sea freight and air freight departments. And so often we're talking to the same company, and they're able to make a determination of whether a shipment needs to move via air or via sea, depending upon the transit requirements that the end user has.
What have some of the major trends been over the past few years in air cargo? Any major kind of developments, innovations, new things going on?
Yeah, I mean, there's been substantial growth of the total business. I mean, ultimately that's being driven by the way that the manufacturing is working and supply chains work. And so, we've seen a trend towards manufacturing being concentrated in one or two locations around the world, not in every country. And so that brings a need for components to be moved around and for finished product to be moved around. And often those components or those finished products need to find their way to a factory or to market quickly. And that's where air freight really becomes attractive and is performing an essential part of many supply chains.
And I suppose that's for laptops. I suppose that's partly because not only are they high value, but also they the components sort of decline in value so quickly that if it spends a month on an ocean liner, ocean freight, it's there's a decline in value of the components.
Right, right. Oftentimes that's the case. I mean, and therefore, products such as that can be described as perishable in nature for that exact reason. It's funny, Will. One of the items that caused us great surprise, and probably the industry, 3 or 4 years ago now, one of the biggest single movements of item from China to the US was fidget spinners. And if you remember, there was a craze, and every kid in the States and probably around the world, had to own a fidget spinner. Now, fidget spinners are actually, very low value, right? I mean, not the sort of product you would anticipate moving by air ordinarily, but fads and crazes tend to pass very, very quickly. And so we had this really odd situation for a couple of months where, everybody in the US wanted a fidget spinner. You couldn't send fidget spinners from Asia to the US via ocean and supply demand quickly enough. And so we and every other carrier that was operating flights between Asia and the US was carrying, tons and tons of fidget spinners. We calculated in the end that we carried over 25 million fidget spinners in a 3 month period, which is crazy. And that's a product, ordinarily you'd scratch your head at and wonder why it would ever move by air. But it's a good example of manufacturers trying to ensure that their product actually is in market at a time where there's still demand for it.
So something that's quote unquote perishable, I suppose that also might apply to, I don't know, apparel that gets printed after the World
Yeah,
Series win or something like that, where people want to get it right away.
yeah. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, we move a huge amount of high fashion. We actually move a lot of fashion for a major retailer based in Spain, and their whole supply chain is based around their whole business model. In fact, is based around providing very, very up-to-date refinement of their product lines. And so, typically in the world of fashion, what happens is fashion houses would spend months building their autumn or winter collection, and they're planning for that many months in advance. And of course, it's a little bit hit and miss because you don't know exactly in March what people are going to be demanding in October, November. Well, this particular organization has a network around the world, and they rely on very rapid inputs from all of their retail outlets around the world. They literally have a team of people sitting in their facility in Spain, speaking to store managers on a daily basis and getting feedback from those store managers around the world about what consumers are demanding. So, do they want shirts with 4 buttons or 5 buttons? And is one particular color more attractive than another particular color? And all of that feedback is being integrated into designs which are being produced and then shipped in the next couple of weeks back out to market. And so constantly, as consumer demand is evolving, so this organization has got a business model that allows their products to continually evolve. Really interesting.
Could you tell us a bit about, so you're the VP of cargo sales. Could you tell us a bit about how cargo sales works? Do you mainly integrate, interface with the freight forwarders or with the, in with their clients, and sort of just how does that whole world work of cargo sales?
Yeah, so the bulk of our direct engagement is with freight forwarders. So about 95% of the business that we transact, we're transacting with a freight forwarder. We've got very long and well-established relationships with many companies. We've got well over 30,000 customers around the world, but actually we have a huge portion of our business that's given to us through our top 100, and many of those customer relationships extend regionally, globally. They're relationships that we've maintained for a very long period of time. And so we have a sales team that's structured fairly traditionally, I would say, to meet the needs of those customers. So we're set up geographically with teams in Europe, Asia, and then North and South America, engaging with each of those customers locally. And then we have a headquarter corporate sales team that are located in our headquarter campus at Fort Worth. And that team is maintaining and fostering corporate relationships with those same customers. And so, we might have a situation with one of our largest customers where we're engaging with them at a headquarter level. So, having global discussions, we're engaging with them regionally. And those two levels are being handled through our global and key account team based at headquarters. And then we're also engaging in local conversations. So the key for us is making sure that our strategy is aligned across all of those conversations. And we're actually doing an effective job of meeting customer needs, in all three areas, across all three areas. Now, the other piece that's perhaps changed, evolved over the last couple of years is our focus on some of the smaller customers. We see a great opportunity to build stronger relationships and an even bigger business base with SMEs. We've set up a team of people in the US to actually manage those relationships now, and that's been very successful. Particularly with some specialty niches around shipments of things like live animals. Some very sensitive types of product. That's a strategy that we are currently in the process of rolling out in other parts of the world.
And how are the arrangements typically structured? Is it with a large freight forwarder? Would they contract for sort of a fixed amount of space on an ongoing basis on a given route, or is it like mostly spot purchases? So every time they put something on there, they'll go get quotes from everybody. Like, how is the whole cargo space kind of structured?
It's a little bit of both, Will, and the answer to that question really depends upon the prevailing market conditions. So we have block space agreements with customers, which are very firm contractual commitments, where a customer signs up typically for 6 or 12 months to provide us with a certain amount of business. And typically those agreements are very granular in nature. So we will commit a certain amount of capacity by day on a certain flight, and the customer commits to using that space. We have slightly broader agreements which commit pricing in return for a certain amount of business over a given period of time, again, typically 3 or 6 months. And then we have the spot market. And that is literally a negotiation on a case by case, a shipment by shipment basis, and subject to the demand on that particular day or week. And the amount of business that's transacted under each of those um, different fashions, it really depends on how demand is at any moment in time. So if I go back 13 or 14 months, the market was incredibly strong, and we were not surprisingly finding that many more of our customers were wanting to enter into longer term agreements. They wanted the surety of knowing that they could get access to capacity, and they wanted consistency in terms of price. As as demand relative to supply weakens, you typically find that customers are more likely to move towards more of a shorter term or spot price discussion.
That's super helpful. Let's use that to transition to kind of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic. So, as passengers,
Yeah.
we sort of just know from the news that just passenger travel is way, way down. What's been going on with cargo shipments?
Well, it's a really interesting dynamic right now, Will. Um, it's been very widely reported that passenger demand, as you mentioned, is down substantially. To give you an indication, American Airlines is flying about 20% of the schedule in May that we flew a year ago, and that's consistent with Delta. It's consistent with United. If you look at some of our European competitors, Lufthansa are flying less than 5% of the capacity that they flew, the flights they flew a year ago. So it's had a huge impact upon what we're doing. And at the same time, so obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, the business that American moves, the cargo business that we moves on our passenger aircraft. So you can imagine if we operate dramatically fewer passenger flights, so we have dramatically less capacity to offer in the marketplace. And yet, at the moment, there's been a huge increase in demand in some markets, primarily linked to the need to move PPE around the world to places which are in critical need. And so you have less capacity at a time where demand is increasing. That's led to a sharp increase in pricing, particularly from Asia to the US. From our perspective, we don't operate flights between Asia and Europe, but it's the same dynamic there. And so actually, we've been able to work with various groups within American Airlines to set up cargo-only flights. So we've done something that we've really never done before. American used to operate freighters in our dim and distant past. We stopped operating them in 1984. But really, since that time, we haven't operated any flights that have just carried cargo. And in the last month, we have done exactly that. And so we've set up operations initially between the US and Europe. And then as we saw the demand situation beginning to unfold, we've started operating cargo-only flights between Asia and the US. In actual fact, between some Latin America markets in the US, which is incredible. And so through doing that, we've been able to provide a really important humanitarian purpose. We're moving critical PPE, pharmaceutical business, medical supplies to markets where they're really needed. We're providing some really much needed work for our teammates around the network, and actually providing cash as well, positive cash flow at a time where the company really needs it.
What is involved in making that kind of quick transition? I can imagine under normal scenarios, kind of something like that would take months of planning and thinking about and deliberations. So what's been
Yeah.
required operationally to create these cargo only flights?
Gosh, well, I think we've all learned a huge amount, Will, over the last few weeks. So, firstly, I've got to stress it's a team effort. So, our cargo revenue management team have done an amazing job of building networks, getting involved with various groups across the airline, as diverse as our network planning team. They're the group within American Airlines that typically build the network we fly. Obviously, typically those are passenger-centered decisions. we have a group of people in our integrated operations center that handle questions like crew. So, it's one thing to decide to operate a flight, but you've actually got to crew that flight. You've got to find pilots to operate it. You've got to find hotels for those pilots to stay in. You've got to arrange for things like overfly approval. So, we've had to go to specific governments to ask for approval to fly through their airspace over the last few weeks. Our pilot group have been incredibly helpful at finding answers, solutions to some of the challenges that have been presented to us. So it's been a lot of work, but incredibly exciting and hugely rewarding to see flights departing, carrying cargo, much needed cargo, and seeing our team members' reactions. We've had our teams in Asia when our American Airlines flights began landing last month. Making signs, welcoming flights back to places like Hong Kong and Shanghai because they hadn't seen an American tail in 2 or 3 months since the start of the crisis.
Wow, that's really so encouraging. One
Yeah.
of the highlights of my consulting career was I did a brief project for a cargo airline where I got to watch them loading a 747 cargo plane, which was
Right.
one of the coolest days in my consulting
Yes.
career. Um, and that was a cargo airline set up for that, where they could bring in these big pallets and strap them down.
Yeah.
What is involved operationally in getting a passenger flight to be ready to have cargo? Do you just leave all the seats on board the plane and kind of strap it to the seats with the seat belts, or how did they tie it all down, and what was that conversion like?
Yeah, so actually, we're not using the passenger cabin. So we're not loading freight in the passenger cabin. Some airlines are. It's a very, very complex process, and there are lots of hurdles to overcome before it makes sense to do that. One of the biggest limiting factors for us, Will, preventing us from doing that is ground time. And so you can imagine when we use the belly of an aircraft, which is what we typically do, then freight is actually built onto ULDs, unit load devices. So they're basically metal pallets.
Mm-hmm.
And those pallets, a bit like the ones that you described when you saw the 747 being loaded and unloaded, those pallets are built in a warehouse and then transported out to the aircraft and loaded quite quickly into the belly of an aircraft. And so that's it's a complex process made to look very easy by our operations team. When you talk about loading freight in the cabin of an aircraft, well, there are all sorts of issues to overcome. The freight has to be physically carried onto the aircraft through the door. You can't fit a big metal pallet on. As you mentioned, you've got seats on board, so you've actually got to figure out a way of attaching freight and securing it to those seats or putting it in overhead bins. And all of that takes time, and unfortunately, the length of time that we have for our turnaround in Asia doesn't allow for that to happen. But the operations teams are just doing an incredible job at fully utilizing the cargo capability that we provide in the belly. And I mean, it's amazing what they're able to fit onto those planes.
Yeah. So okay. So that was a naive question. So when we say cargo only flight, the passenger cabin is empty. They're using the normal belly place, and then the place where normally passenger baggage would go, is that being used for cargo as
Correct.
well? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So passenger bags are normally loaded into the belly. There is a small bulk hold on aircraft which we're utilizing as well, but that's also in the belly as well. So that would require, physically hand loading smaller shipments.
Okay, got it. And then any other kind of changes, like is it do the pilots have to uh, do anything different, or is it? It sounds like it's pretty much they're flying a normal passenger flight. It just there's no passengers on board.
That's exactly right, Will. Yeah, as far as the pilots are concerned, it's just a normal operation, and they operate as per normal.
So I can imagine when you said that the number of flights is down to 20% of normal. That means that just the capacity would be so far reduced. So you're finding then that you're adding back some flights that are cargo only to
Yeah,
support the demand.
we are. Yeah, so and pretty substantial numbers. So for the last 2 weeks, we operated 50 cargo only flights. We're going to be up to almost 100 a week from this week moving forward, which is great. And we're actually in the process of building our June schedule. So on the tomorrow morning, we've got a meeting with our network planning team to really assess where we're going to be operating as cargo only flights in June.
Yeah. So, how do you, with so much uncertainty in a role like yours, how do you plan for the different potential scenarios of how, things might play out over the next 6 months to a year?
With difficulty. It's really challenging. I mean, I don't think anybody could have foreseen where the industry is headed in the last 2 months. I mean, it's literally 2 months. It's incredible how quickly things have changed. I think what's key is ensuring that we're nimble enough as an organization to be able to respond. So, look, some of it is obviously being proactive, right? We've got some fantastic customer relationships in place, and we are utilizing those relationships to begin to enter into longer term conversations around where capacity might be needed, how are we going to meet those needs, how do we need to structure agreements, and then some of it is just being prepared to be nimble as an organization. And that's one thing that I think American Cargo has done really well over the last couple of years. And a good indication of that has been, the work for our teams has changed substantially over the last couple of months. And so, we have a lot of people who are incredibly busy dealing with, short-term challenges. But we also have some groups whose day job has changed a little bit, and there may be less work for them to do. And so those organizations, those people, we've been able to repurpose into smaller project teams and have them focus on short-term revenue and cost initiatives. And so we've got about 13 work streams now focused on things like, how can we improve capacity utilization in the short term? How can we streamline our booking process to ensure that we utilize as much of our capacity as possible and don't experience no shows or reduce the number of no shows. We're also looking at things like pick up and drop off. How can we provide additional service to our customers by extending the value that we provide to them?
Any other innovations that have come up that have almost been accelerated or kind of caused by the new way of working of folks either working from home or in my discussions with other executives, I've heard things like customer acceptance testing where they used to have the customer fly over from Korea, but now they do it by video conference. Things like that. Any other changes that you've developed?
Yeah, I think, look, I'll highlight a couple. I think, as far as the whole customer relationship is concerned, it's really interesting. I mentioned the relationship that we have with freight forwarders, and we have freight forwarders are hugely important for American Airlines, will be in the future. But we also are working to establish relationships with some of the end users, some of the manufacturers and shippers. Mainly because we want to understand exactly what those customers' needs, really are. So we're able to hear directly from the manufacturer what their need is as far as transit's concerned, for example. And actually, as a result of conversations with our passenger team over the last couple of months, we've been able to increase the number of direct conversations we've been having with major manufacturers who might be both a customer to American Airlines on the passenger side and a customer to us, an indirect customer to us on the cargo side. So that dynamic's been interesting and one that I think will continue to grow and evolve over the coming weeks. I mentioned a few moments ago that we've been working on processes to ensure that our capacity is utilized most effectively. One of the biggest challenges that we face as an industry, and I'll stress this isn't an American Airlines issue, this is an industry issue for the cargo industry as a whole, is the fact that the airlines carry all the risk. And so today, when or prior to May the 1st, I'll say on American, when a customer makes a booking for a significant proportion of the business that we take bookings for, the airline carries the risk. And so by that, I mean, if a customer decides to cancel that booking at short notice or worse, not to show up and not to even tell us, then there is no penalty. And frankly, that's a crazy situation if you compare that to almost any other transaction that takes place. I mean, think about hotels, for example. You book a hotel, you have a period within which you can make a change or a cancellation. But once you get beyond that period, close into the booking, there's a penalty for booking, and that's appropriate. I mean, why should the hotel, lose out? Why should they protect capacity and then not be able to utilize that because a customer has changed their mind? And it's the same for us in the cargo world. And one of the biggest challenges we face as an industry is the fact that customers will often change bookings late on in, and there may be very legitimate reasons for that. Well, as a result of the way that we've changed our thinking over the last few weeks, we've been able to introduce a fair booking policy. And this was one of the work streams I touched upon earlier. And the purpose of this policy is to ensure that customers give us fair notification of booking changes or booking cancellations. It's something that we've talked about for 2 years. We've been unable to implement because, frankly, we've had a lot of other stuff going on, and we just haven't done a good enough job of prioritizing this, perhaps. But in the current climate, where capacity is absolutely critical, particularly given the nature of goods that are moving, pharmaceutical, PPE, that sort of thing, we felt that it was fair and reasonable to introduce a policy that actually ensured that when customers made a booking, they turned up with what they were booked. And if they cancel or change late in, we are applying a fee to help compensate. But this is less about collection of the fee. I mean, really, the fee revenue is not something we're interested in. It's really about changing behavior. All we want is to create an environment in which customers are giving us as much notification as possible when bookings are changing, because that way we have better insight as to what's actually going to show up for our flights, and so we're able to say yes to more customers. We've in the environment today, we have customers who are calling to make a booking for a flight tomorrow. The flight looks to be full. We turn them away, and if a customer no shows, that flight actually goes out with empty capacity.
Well, just on the other side of that cargo wall in the passenger cabin, it's certainly you don't refund my ticket if I just don't show up for the flight. So
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
no, that's interesting. It's interesting, how just it's kind of something that would just make sense to do, and you've been wanting to, and it's an example of using this time effectively to get projects done that that have been on your list of to do items.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and any other thoughts on any kind of changes that you expect to potentially persist after things kind of get back to close to normal, or
Yeah, or whatever normal is, right? I mean, I think there's going to be a change in terms of use of technology, right? I mean, we've seen it. I think every other company you speak to will highlight the use of video conferencing. We've certainly found there are pros and cons, to be honest. Look, we're an airline, so we rely upon people actually flying around and meeting face to face, and I firmly believe that as we move beyond this crisis, there's still going to be a demand for people to travel. There's still going to be a demand for people to go to cool places, for vacation, and there's still going to be a demand for products and services to move by air as well. But I think we'll see, certainly in the short term, greater willingness to perhaps use technology and to leverage some of that technology. The need will likely be increased, as well as we're all mindful of social distancing in the first few months.
well, thanks for that, Roger. Thank you so much for joining today. It's fascinating to hear what's going on in air cargo industry and the innovations that you've taken recently. Really appreciate you taking time to be on the show.
Well, thanks again for the invite, Will. It's been a real pleasure chatting this morning.